Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone from whatever corner of the world you're joining. I'm Dr. Manan Thakrar. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I'm based in London. Today, I have someone who I'll start off by narrating a little bit of an incident. I was a psychiatry resident, a first year resident in psychiatry, and the World Federation of Mental Health Conference was happening in Delhi. And the moment I entered, we were in the main symposium. I was with my PG teacher, Dr. Laklawala, and I was entering the main seminar hall. And there was this one man at the center commanding the whole stage. And the way he used references, his knowledge, not only the knowledge, but the oration, made a massive, massive impact on me. And this was Dr. Nimesh Desai. Sir, I've known you since I was a child. But
Yeah.
whatever I had heard about you and whatever I had known about you, that day was that image is going to be one of the images that will stay with me till the very end, I think. And it was such an impactful.
Of you, those very kind of you.
So thank you so much for being here today. Um, I I would love I would love for us to dwell into a lot of specifics, but to start off, um, I would love for you to throw some light on your journey in psychiatry, starting from why psychiatry.
I did a boarding school education in my secondary school, and that was a kind of military school, as we in India call Sainik schools. You lived and grew up in Jamnagar, so you know that. Um, I was almost certain in my school days as to what I wanted to do. It was either military and psychiatry or both. I would have possibly been a military psychiatrist, but for some reasons that I think sensible people advised me against it. And so here I am with 40 odd years of psychiatry.
So, sir, you've had a glorious career. You've worked with AIIMS, you've worked with NIMHANS. What was that journey like? What was your training like? And during your residency, who were the psychiatrists who influenced you and you looked up to?
Right. Must say, I did my medicine and psychiatry both in Gujarat, Ahmedabad.
Hmm.
Dr. Anil Shah, our teacher, who is still around, touch wood, God bless him. But it's also like you narrated your experience, Manan. As a first year PG, I went to NIMHANS Bangalore in 1979-80, where they had a joint conference.
Hmm.
And to put it briefly, that's something that I haven't got out of, like you're narrating your experience. Here was 43 years ago, 44 years ago, the Indian Psychiatric Society, Indian Association of Clinical Psychology, Indian Society for Professional Social Work, and the Neurological Society of India holding their annual conferences together with 3 years planning ahead. Okay. And in 79-80, they had 2,000 registered delegates.
Hmm. Oh.
So this idea of neuropsychiatry integration, neuroclinical neuroscience and psychiatry and mental health integration, and the multidisciplinary mental health team with psychology and social work kind of got imbibed right there. And
Hmm.
of course, I was sold on NIMHANS as an institution. And so soon as I finished MD in Ahmedabad, I wasn't pathologically enough interested in making money, and I still am not. And so I went to NIMHANS as a senior resident.
Hmm.
I must also quickly share this. I was the first non-NIMHANS MD as a post-MD senior resident in NIMHANS that they were willing to take.
Hmm.
They always had their own MD graduates as senior residents, because senior resident in a clinical unit used to be the kingpin,
Yeah.
the fulcrum of all services and coordination. So they liked me, I liked them. I got on the faculty of NIMHANS. Those 6 years were wonderful.
Hmm.
I never thought I'll leave NIMHANS and Bangalore. But as you alluded to, AIIMS Delhi pulled me up to Delhi, and now it's been what? All in all, 35, nearly 36 years in Delhi. I must say here in a lighter vein, am I too thrilled about being in the national capital? I'm not too sure.
Hmm.
But as life has had it, there is where I am.
Did you work in a particular subspecialty during your time in NIMHANS?
Yes. Family psychiatry and family therapy,
Okay.
alcohol and drug abuse treatment.
Hmm.
In fact, I still love the idea of family and group therapy.
mm,
If I could have, I would have possibly spent an entire career or a decade or 2 decades on that. I only do smattering of that here and there when an opportunity comes up. But yes, those were two. In fact, it was my work and interest in alcohol and drug abuse treatment that pulled me to AIIMS, because what is now the National Drug Dependence Treatment Center of AIIMS Delhi, that was coming up way back then in the late 80s.
right, right.
And so I came to AIIMS largely for, but I must say this, and I'm sure you'll come to that, but allow me. Um, the 10 years at AIIMS was wonderful. As the premier medical institution, the interface of psychiatry and mental health with all the disciplines, the richness of the AIIMS faculty, which was that time 500, now it's much more. And most importantly, if I might say, my individual growth and confidence and comfort as a clinician.
Mm,
You see, NIMHANS and many other of these institutions have a concept of a team, which is wonderful. But AIIMS, for good or bad, many departments, including psychiatry, did not really have, still don't think have too much of a team functioning.
mm,
So it's at the cost of exaggeration, at least in the 90s, that the decade that I spent at AIIMS Delhi before moving out was essentially a government sector polyclinic.
mm, right.
Okay.
Mm,
So the outpatient work and the inpatient work and whatever community work you wanted to do was all individual effort.
mm,
But that was wonderful. Again, I would have possibly never left AIIMS,
mm.
but be that as it may.
So one of the things that, like, you've got a unique experience of working in AIIMS and NIMHANS, and one of the things that I do think about a lot is how different a general hospital setting and a psychiatry department there is to a psychiatry institute. Do you have any reflections or notes that what were the differences in your experiences between NIMHANS and AIIMS?
That's a very legitimate, oft raised question, but I really think that's like comparing apples and oranges.
Yeah.
Or if not apples and oranges, at least two or three different species of oranges
Mm,
or apples, because a neuropsychiatry institution like NIMHANS Bangalore, CIP Ranchi, and a few others are entirely different, focus on the brain and mind issues. And at AIIMS Delhi or PGI, or now this 30 odd AIIMS that you have in the country, it is one of those 25 30 specialties, and so it's very different. That is where, yes, I do believe that I was lucky after my studies in Ahmedabad. It was very nice by the time I kind of completed my first 2 decades in psychiatry to have gathered both NIMHANS and AIIMS experience. You
I
know?
think that's a very unique career trajectory, especially NIMHANS and AIIMS within the first, say, 10 years of having qualified, 10, 15
Hmm.
years of having qualified. And
Hmm.
then what pulled you to ABAS? That it wasn't like, you mentioned NIMHANS, AIIMS, and then you mentioned ABAS at that time back in the day. Now, even in the UK, I've seen so many people who have been trained under you, trained by you.
Hmm.
And I'm sure some of the people watching this will be people who were your PG students. But IBAS wasn't half as well known when you joined it. What pulled you?
I must say hello to all those friends who might be watching this at any point of time in the next few months or years, who have had anything to do with IBAS, to say a big warm hello. IBAS has been wonderful in many ways. Although must say, candidly, a mixed experience. But Manan, I have sometimes in public meetings and once even on public television said this in a lighter vein, and yet I think there's a tinge of valid self observation there. In 1998, I must have had a psychotic breakdown. Retrospectively, I mean, who in his or her right mind in the late 90s in Indian scenario moved from the apex premier institution nearing the top of the seniority to a new upcoming institution that was still old style mental hospital in far end of town,
Yeah,
you know? Um, But that's that. I mean, we all know, right? The whole idea of normalcy or psychotic or neurotic breakdown or temporary mental health issue is all relative and subject to interpretation. So that's what I mean when I say that. I do mean it with a tinge of seriousness. Yes, I'm pathological enough in my commitment for public service in taking up challenges and not having the hesitation to charter new grounds. I must briefly say this. Um, in the 80s at NIMHANS, I used to wonder as a young faculty and say, why don't we have 5 or 10 or 15, at least 5 more NIMHANS institutions in the country?
Hmm.
And so, after I moved to AIIMS Delhi and worked, when the opportunity for IBAS came up, um, my difficulty is my effort at consonants.
Hmm.
I mean, in our terms, OC traits. So those OC traits kind of made, look, I mean, you have been talking about this, and when there's an opportunity, should you not be the one to be able to and willing to take risks?
Hmm.
And I did. And believe you me, to say it briefly, having done that for 23 years and now 2 years after having completed that, it's been a rough journey. It was a risk worth taking, with its own merits and demerits.
Yeah. So,
Not been easy, not been easy. But what's been wonderful, almost as a rule, is in this 20 odd years, 23 years that I spent at IBAS, while a whole lot of colleagues in different disciplines was good fun, nurses and the other professionals, the psychiatry colleagues that I had, from faculty members who are now spread around the world to postgraduates, as you said, as we introduced PG programs and they grew in numbers gradually. But a group of what you know as in India and South Asia, senior residents,
hmm.
no? Classified specialists or staff grade psychiatrists, as I suppose you call them. That has been one of the richest experiences. I mean, almost to a fault. And believe you me, and I'm sure a lot of people who are watching this, will be watching this, will be chuckling even before I say this, and I think they know what I'm coming to. I was a hawkeye,
Hmm.
and that's putting it very mildly. Here was this old mental hospital in the national capital that the apex court had said you must develop like the man's, and there was this huge, unfortunately, background and baggage that we were carrying as a hospital of human rights violation unspeakable. And so I was like a hawkeye and much more.
Hmm.
And yet the good part was that almost everyone at some point of time in 2, 3 or 5 or 10 years that we spent together, they intellectually appreciated and understood and welcomed that commitment to patient care and human rights protection.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. All my colleagues who've trained at IBAS speak really highly of the work ethic that has been inculcated into them. When you joined IBAS, sir, what sort of situation was the hospital? It wasn't a teaching institute at that time, was it? Like there weren't
No,
theses.
it had been named from Hospital for Mental Diseases to IBAS for about 6 years, and there were some ground level changes that my senior colleagues, like Professor Ashley Sharma, specifically the founder director, had made.
Hmm.
The basic amenities of water supply and electricity and stuff. But in terms of clinical care, the postgraduate training and the active promotion of human rights and the work ethic was far out. It was actually very very troublesome. Must also say for some briefly. Soon after I moved from AIIMS to IBAS, I moved away to Baltimore.
Hmm.
I was lucky to have a Fulbright Humphrey Fellowship that took me to Hopkins School of Public Health for a year. And so got trained in public health, the rigorousness of the American, especially Hopkins or Harvard, especially Hopkins, fastidiousness about public health, and the whole work ethic part that you were referring to. And so when I got back from Baltimore, again, I mean, lot of my friends of different era know this. It's been a rough ride. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy with some of my contemporary colleagues. It wasn't easy with some of my younger colleagues. It certainly wasn't easy with some of the senior colleagues outside the hospital in the government machinery.
Hmm.
Um, so there have been lots of crests and troughs,
Hmm.
but all in all, it's been satisfying. And yes, the hospital has worked well. I must mention this briefly, Bob. The quality assurance part in mental health, and just finished writing a chapter on that for Indian Psychiatric Society, reform of mental hospitals, in fact. Um, Way back in 1999, NHRC and NIMHANS came up with this quality assurance in mental health report of all the mental hospitals in the country. And I'd been the AIIMS for a short time by then. They recognized that AIIMS was on track and that could be a good role model. And yet, the formalized quality assurance in healthcare, internationally known as the Joint Councils International (JCI) recognition, and in India since 2008, what's called the NABH accreditation, National Accreditation Board for Hospitals. Um, we worked assiduously for that benchmark of quality assurance, NABH full accreditation, and 2012 we were one of the 15 government hospitals in the country out of the 200 all NABH accredited hospitals to have full NABH accreditation.
Mm.
You remember the two hospitals at Ahmedabad and Baroda, also the hospitals for mental health, got that soon after.
Yeah.
You know, so that was very satisfying. And I must say this again to illustrate a point besides self-narrative. I remember one of the correspondents print, sir, why did you have to try so much and work hard, make your team work so hard for NABH accreditation? IBAS is, after all, a government mental hospital.
Mm.
Okay. It's not one of those corporate hospitals. It's not a general hospital. And I remember saying to her, and I said, look, there are two principles involved. One, I don't understand or see why anybody in public sector, not directly paying for these services, unlike the private sector, but paid for by the government, should also not have quality assurance.
Yeah.
At the same level. Two, I don't see why neuropsychiatry patients, neurology, neurosurgery, psychiatry, all should not have quality assurance at par with the other health issues. And
Absolutely.
so those two things still hold.
Yeah.
I mean, we have moved further up as a country, as a human race, and as mental health professionals. But I think it still needs to be said. Allow me to say this, crystallize the chapter that I said I've just finished writing. I do believe that world over there is any number of good examples for reformed mental hospitals as mental health institutions, academic research, and good service hospitals. But India certainly offers that very well. And so my case is that the Italian experience of closing down hospitals or the experience of merely deinstitutionalizing, clearing out long stay patients is not enough. What is required, I think, world over, with some tempering and molding, is reform mental hospitals to academic neuropsychiatry or mental health institutions with the full range of services.
So, as a young man, when you went to IBAS for the first time, after having worked in NIMHANS and AIIMS, how many people did you have there? So how many service users or patients did you have? And what was the staffing levels like? And what was your initial impressions of how much work needs to be
Terrible,
done here?
terrible. It wasn't good at all. But must say, because it was created and upgraded through Supreme Court initiative, a large part of the core funding was not an issue ever. And also, being in the national capital, the state government of Delhi is reasonably well provided foreign resources, so that wasn't a major issue per se. But yes, I'll keep saying this in different ways. Partly also for all our friends or who have been associated with IBAS to recall, I went for reform within IBAS like a bull in a china shop. And was it always well received? No, it wasn't. It never is. Reform in mental health, especially client-oriented or person-oriented, human rights-based reform, is almost as a rule never taken very well. I'm crystallizing this also so that we all realize that in different situations, wherever we work and we get an opportunity to work, if some of us or more than some of us are going to work for genuinely human rights based clinical care, you're sure to face resistance and more. But it'll have to be negotiated. And for me, the human rights of persons with mental illness was an issue non-negotiable. There was zero tolerance for any. I will say this again, subject to whatever length you can carry of our conversation. A few things that we did as soon as I joined. Said, look, any complaint, any report by any person in the ward or any other setting, OPD or emergency, however symptomatic that person may be, mania, schizophrenia, paranoid, but any report about if he or she says that she was not treated well or treated inappropriately will be given due attention and investigated.
Hmm.
That usual tendency in custodial institutions to say, oh, he's psychotic or he's in mania or he's paranoid, and so he or she is saying this, was not on.
Hmm.
You see, what happens, my friend, often in almost all custodial and many residential institutions across the social sector is advertent, planned, empathic for colleagues kind of cover up, or at least inadvertent passive cover up.
Hmm.
And one thing that I'm convinced about, and I will be till my last day, is any situation where a team or an individual has a responsibility for care of other people who are kind of temporarily or otherwise not able to speak up, there is and there can be no scope for cover up.
Hmm.
We will not, and we never did, pillory or penalize any staff member without adequate investigation and opportunity. But I'll repeat myself. However many, I'll tell you a simple example. Some years later, we used to provide direct telephone lines in each ward complex. And so patients who are admitted there might want to use the phone call to call the family, to call up the police. India has this number of what the Americans call as 911, somewhat 100, right? And so my nursing and psychiatric colleagues would say, sir, he's in mania, he will keep calling, he'll give us bad name. I said, look, that's all right. As a citizen, it's that person's right to call 100, even if he or she is admitted to my ward. Let him call up, let the police come, investigate, talk to the person. I trust the police will understand that he is symptomatic and he is doing it out of his phenomenology.
Yeah.
But any one of us at IHBAS or any such hospital blocking that right of the person to call out on the phone is not on.
Was it the 80s, sir, when you joined IHBAS, roughly? 1980s?
No, late 90s, 98.
98. And how
Down
many
on this
hospital was it at that time? How many wards and
see, it was supposed to be 350 bed, and there were a whole lot of people. Again, Dr. Sharma's team initially, even before I joined, had kind of discharged a lot of people back to their families. But what's interesting there is this. Over next 10 or 20 years, from about 2001 or 2 to 20 or 21, what I think we all achieved collectively, a whole lot of effort by a different group of not just clinicians in psychiatry, nurses, but also our social work colleagues, was this. Not only was there adequate care for whoever was there, but a couple of things that, if I might bring that as we were discussing informally, I believe and very humbly claim that we went one step beyond deinstitutionalization. The mandate for NIMHANS in the 70s or 60s and 70s was, and CIP it was done. By now, many hospitals have this mandate of deinstitutionalization. And that's fine. I believe and claim that we went one step beyond that to prevention of institutionalization. And that is to be evidenced by a few important bullet points. One, low admission rate. By 2005 or 10, IHBAS had built a daily average OPD of about 1,500 in psychiatry. 1,500 visits every morning between 9 to 1. And of course, clinical neurology had another 800 or 1,000, right? That's one figure in itself, and to maintain quality assurance with that. But what was very satisfying individually and collectively was that The percent of people getting hospitalized was less than 1%.
mm,
So the fact that at a old mental hospital, neuropsychiatric institution, where you get the most severe florid people with psychotic symptoms and gross behavior disturbance, 99% of the people were possible to be treated on outpatient.
mm,
Not only now in the 2020s, but way back in 2003, 4 or 5.
mm,
So low hospitalization rate, shift the locus of treatment to outpatient. Two, keep the admission as short as possible. The average length of stay when I went to IBAS was about 4 to 6 months.
mm,
Within 5 or 7 years, we had brought it down with effective clinical treatment to 2 to 3 weeks.
mm,
Okay. Most importantly, make sure that the clinical recovery and the social relocation and reintegration into the family or the society happens.
mm,
As I kept saying in simple language, match the outflow with the inflow.
mm,
So don't let the congestion happen.
mm,
And most importantly, meaningful rehab with the families as far as possible. So that was great. That was very satisfying. Um, Very active emergency service. I must admit, what did not happen too well, and I hope it happens. It happens at very few institutions. Is real, deeper, meaningful integration of clinical mental health with clinical neuroscience.
mm,
See, the whole idea of NIMHANS, Bangalore, or IVAS, or a few now private sector institutions is to actually see, as we came up with the slogan for IVAS, brain mind problems and their solutions.
mm,
So, when you have stroke, when you have dementia, when you have Parkinson's disease, or when you have epilepsy, there are those other mental health aspects that are important. And there's a whole lot of, as you and I both know, there's a whole lot of CNS basis to behavioral manifestations and presentations. That is beginning to happen, and is yet not at its best. That's one thing that didn't happen. The biopsychosocial model of integration of mental health services again is happening to an extent. I must express this though. Um, it's difficult to carry every group and everybody with you on the reform path.
mm,
It's not easy, and a lot of agencies and groups of people perhaps do not see mental health reform, especially in public institutions, as a huge priority still. I do wish countries like India, by leadership, and thereby a whole lot of countries in India, South Asia, Africa, would follow suit by what I call as reform of mental health institutions.
One of the things that we were discussing before we started recording was the multi-stakeholder reality, and I think that's a fascinating concept, especially when you compare India or any other country. And I'll sort of touch on the Mental Health Care Act as well, where I know that I'm not sure whether the legal framework to be decided in a country like India can be drawn inspiration from a country like UK, because in the UK also, to be very honest, there are challenges with the Mental Health Act here,
Right.
which we as practitioners face mainly around the recording of capacity.
Mm.
Although we want to empower people as much as we want, when someone is very very unwell, those things do tend to get in the way of us being able to proactively provide them the treatment that they legitimately need. So, in a country like India, having worked in this field for say 40 odd years, how do
Mm.
you see policy going forward, and where do you see the roadblocks with the Mental Health Care Act?
I do sincerely believe in my considered view that the human rights model, the disability rights, application of principles should be contextualized not as per geographical boundaries but as per socio-cultural milieu,
Hmm,
and that's not happening. Um, the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disability, UNCRPD, is is obviously a very good instrument. I mean, there can't be much of a doubt about that. But I do wish the UNCRPD or it had done or its newer version some years from now will see the need for socio-cultural contextualization, as you described so well, in fact. Um, the 2016 Rights of Persons with Disability Act in India, which replaced 1995 Act of Persons with Disability, and the 2017 Mental Health Care Act, which replaced the 87 Mental Health Act, they're both to align with UNCRPD as a contractual international obligation and as a matter of, as I've been told by policymakers and senior bureaucrats, as a legislative intent. While that is fair, the difficulty with the Mental Health Care Act in India particularly is that it's too aspirational and so unrealistic. Now, my discomfort has always been, and I must veer off to a tangent a little bit and share this. Um, Again, luckily, for last 20 years, beginning with 2001, 2 or 3, I have been involved with disability activist groups for intellectual developmental disabilities or even other physical disabilities. And that is mainly for learning. I admit this on every platform that I've learned a whole lot from disability activists, including mental health activists who might be rabid critics of all psychiatrists.
Hmm.
And they are.
Hmm.
But I genuinely have learned a whole lot from them and I keep learning. So having had that journey alongside the journey in clinical mental health, I do believe that while legislative intent and aspirational idealistic goals are good to set for policies and programs, when you set aspirational, ambitious, bombastic provisions in a law, there's a potential problem. And so, like many of us feel here, the Indian psychiatrists in general, specifically the Indian Psychiatric Society, as you're well aware, and the Indian Association of Private Psychiatry, is fairly uncomfortable with the MHA 2017 as it stands today. There certainly is there is indeed, it might be said that to a great extent it's been a copy paste of the English Mental Health Act, the last version, and obviously that can't work. You know, um, so the thing is that yes, at the international level, there will have to be, and I must mention this again briefly here. I do work a fair bit over the last 20 years in different capacities with what's called the National Human Rights Commission. And I do believe, my sense, if I might crystallize, is that through many people's effort, the NHRC and the human rights activists are also beginning to realize and accept the fact that there cannot be a one size fits all model of human rights when it comes to disabilities and specifically mental health or mental illness related disability.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there will have to be that variation and adoption to local situations. Um, but having said that, I must also say that, like you described your own experience in England, and a lot of people are feeling in India, and here I somewhere stand in the middle. There are some difficulties where we started off this segment of the conversation. There are some difficulties that psychiatrists and most people have. One is that there was a point of time when psychiatrists was the only group other than the family members of persons with mental illness who were concerned about people with severe mental illness or psychosis, as they were called, right? No other segment of the society gave a damn about what happened to these people, let's face it. And I have said on national television, let's credit the psychiatrists of the country and the world with the fact that over the last 70 or 100 years, for large part, it was only the psychiatrists who stood by with their best abilities. Now, for last 10 or 20 years, for good or bad, and largely for good, a whole lot of other groups have joined in. Welcome. But let's realize that the psychiatrists will have a bit of a problem in sharing the stage. Multi-stakeholder reality is an issue as I see it for that reason. The second is that there isn't, unfortunately, and we tried that. I must, in a few sentences, share that with you. For last 10 or 15 years, we tried that a fair bit in Delhi and at the national level. Didn't work too well, but it's an ongoing process. Dialogues across these different groups of multi-stakeholder reality.
Hmm.
Obviously, the clinical psychiatrists, allied mental health, non-medical professionals, the concerned nurses, the human rights activists, the users of mental health services, their family members, and the disability activists who get into mental health have very different agenda
Hmm.
and concerns. The trick is in finding that common ground. I guess that's evolving still.
Do you think, sir, in a country like India where spirituality also plays a massive, massive role in anyone's mental health? It does in any corner of the world. But do you see a future where, say, a Gita or say a Bible would be taught, and there would be classes or there would be spiritual lessons happening in mental health organizations?
Sure, and that's beginning to happen. But there's another double-edged sword there. The double-edged sword is this: in the like I was talking about how deinstitutionalization contributes to homelessness because of absence of other alternative mechanisms. Similarly, because family members are helpless ever so often, even if they want to look after the person with mental illness who possibly might have been left with some deficits, because there was a huge almost absence or relative lack of long stay residential or rehabilitation facilities, the persons with mental illness ended up being in religious, spiritual, or faith based organizations.
Hmm.
Okay. Very often the family actually paying for it too. It wasn't only charity based. And to recall that very unpleasant event of 22 years ago, the Erwadi tragedy that you must have read and heard about. See, that happened in the unorganized sector, faith based. So I must say, the Honorable Supreme Court in this country has taken a very good view way back then. Again, remains to be implemented in toto across the board. Of course, for day to day wellness and positive mental health, as you were mentioning, all of that is wonderful. But when it comes to faith based or spirituality or religion based organizations for persons with severe mental disorders, there is a concern, and that is that while we would in this society we should and we will encourage faith based or religious spiritual organizations, what's again non-negotiable at macro plane to my mind and should be is like I had at IBAS, no human rights violation.
Hmm.
And that unfortunately is a difficult thing to achieve. A lot of these faith-based organizations, you remember the places in Gujarat also where our friend Ajay Chauhan works, very well. Erwadi is a damn good example. There are places in North India where in the name of religious or faith-based treatment, there are mechanisms and procedures done which are violative of human rights protocols.
Hmm.
That cannot be all right. So while we will encourage them, we should also, in the traditional mold, let families choose where they want to take the person.
Hmm.
What's non-negotiable is human rights protocols.
While we're discussing preventative
Prevention of issues, right?
deinstitutionalization, and
Yes.
I think we did, when we initially discussed doing a podcast, we discussed about over-psychiatricization as well.
Yes.
And
Yes. Uh, my two penny bit in how I think this is working out. See, as we know, since the 2000 World Mental Health Report, it's been by and large agreed that the global figures for diagnosable, worthy of treatment mental health problems is 25%, give or take a few. American figures are much higher, but that's another debate altogether, relevant here somewhat. Indian figures, we had good data even before, and the National Mental Health Survey of 2016 confirmed that is about 10 to 12%.
Hmm.
So while globally it is 1 in 4, possibility of psychiatric mental health disorder, in India it's 1 in 10. We have a huge opportunity, not just in India and South Asia, but Afro-Asia, to not let the Western experience be repeated. And that is, to put it differently, not every unpleasant or irregular human experience of emotion, of behavior, of intellect, of thought, in an individual or in a couple or in a family, need be given a psychiatric label and started on medication.
Hmm.
See, whole lot of interpersonal or individual issues are temporary, and with your own help or with your friends and family, you get on with
Hmm.
life. You know. Now that is what I am really concerned about. In fact, go a step back. In the 1960s, a lot of Western researchers observed in Afro-Asian context and said, "You guys are under psychologized. You
Hmm.
don't know how to express psychological distress. Plead guilty." But my counter to that is, what if I were to say by now, at least 21st century, that maybe you guys in the West, for whatever generalization that holds, are over psychologized and over psychiatricized?
Hmm.
That's an equal possibility. And let me put it differently, Mahan. Even in terms of French cultural psychiatry, you remember that whole set of literature about culture bound syndromes. Now, I believe that that was a period when the Western scientists and clinicians were the observers.
Yeah.
And we, the people in Afro-Asia, we were the observed.
Hmm.
We were in the crucible, and here would be this team of behavioral scientists or mental health professionals who will come and say, "Oh, you have that. We don't have it. You have it."
Hmm.
Now, as Thomas Friedman has argued in his 2005 book, the Earth is flat.
Hmm.
The world is becoming a more uniform place. So, what if I were to turn around and now you are sitting in the UK, London? What if I were to say to you and many such friends and colleagues there and say, "We will observe you"? The observed becomes the observer. Let me give you an example. From the time of Columbine, the first major such event, all of those senseless, reckless shootings, killing tens and fifties of people in the US, how is that any different from running amok?
Yeah.
Right? That's a 21st century American version of running amok found in Indonesia.
Hmm.
So this whole idea of cultural relativism
Hmm.
and culture bound syndromes and where should a society be on a 0 to 10 scale of psychologizing or psychiatricizing difficulties of day-to-day existence is a debate that I think we need to really activate.
I think a couple of very, yeah, sorry, please go on.
Please bring up.
A couple of very important things, like fascinating things that I did. One of the main things that pulled me to the UK was the transcultural side of things. As a student of psychiatry, like probably like you were fascinated with NIMHANS, I was fascinated with, okay, I've seen how mental health is in India and how, say,
Right.
conversion disorder or FNSD
No.
is in India. I want to see as to how is it different in a completely different culture, setup, nation. So I
Hmm.
worked in a small fishing town for 2 years. Now I'm
Hmm.
in London, and you see that cities also, not only countries, but cities and the local culture plays a massive, massive role in how the manifestation of even the phenomenology of delusions or the content of delusions, the content of hallucinations, very majorly is impacted by your geographical location and socio-cultural upbringing.
The pathoplasticity of psychiatric phenomenology.
Hmm.
you know but that's one part, as we are was saying. What about the gross issue of numbers of people?
Yeah,
Come back to
especially
that for a bit.
ADHD. Like these days, the number of ADHD assessments are shooting through the roof, especially in the Western world, and I think that is happening in India as well. Like we see a disparity in eating disorders. Asian countries don't have massive numbers of eating disorders, whereas there's wards. There's hardly ever any empty beds in the eating disorders units in any
Right.
Western country. Similarly, you
Right.
don't see a lot of conversion disorder, but the severity of personality disorders that I've seen in Western countries is
Is if I might switch gears one more time. I'm no philosopher. I'm not even a student of philosophy. But with whatever limitations I have, and possibly you and I both have, at a very deeper philosophical conceptual plane, the issue can also be this: on behalf of human race, we, the mental health scientists, at what stage should we be referring to something as abnormal? That whole debate about normal versus abnormal, right?
yeah,
Uh, is it possible to argue that human race and the establishment, including us, the mental health establishment, finds it convenient to give a label to something that we find abnormal or unusual. You know, and but let me exemplify that again. Apolitical, neutral positioning, wherever, but from India, you remember there is this whole lot of talk about farmer suicides,
Yeah.
right? Now, lot of my contemporaries and my senior colleagues who are into committee concerned government or the policy makers started including psychiatrists and mental health professionals in matters of assessing and understanding and preventing farmer suicide. So far, so good. Till somebody pointed out to me and said, "Hey, Nimesh, you don't realize what the society or the government does is, firstly, they don't have conducive healthy policies for the farmers. Okay, the economic policies are flawed, and as a result of the flawed economic policies, when there are suicides, they easily use you guys in psychiatry and psychiatry as a discipline as an explanatory model. So it's quite possible that, like there was the use and abuse of psychiatry in the Nazi era and the Soviet bloc, and like in some other extreme regimes, it's also possible that in a less threatening, more innocuous manner, the human society is perhaps using psychiatry to explain away things which they should be looking after in a different lens better.
Yeah, absolutely. While we're while we're talking about the whole old school era, I would love for you to talk about the psychiatrists who shaped you. I know you're an avid reader. What are the psychiatrists who shaped you, who influenced you, and you look up to?
Quite a few in India, US, UK, across. Um, I've
And
been
what
lucky.
we do is I can try sharing my screen, and I can Google and we can go through some of the work of a couple of them that you find fascinating. Do you want to
Michael
tell us
Shepard
about?
for one.
Yeah.
Michael Shepard for one. Our friend Dinesh Bugra for another. A
Hmm.
whole lot. But my interest in reading, and this is where I'm sure you will agree, and a whole lot of our friends will agree. You see, a psychiatrist or a mental health professional actually has to be concerned about everything that has to do with life.
Hmm.
So I'm hugely interested in literature, movies, theater, music, performing arts, and so there are writers beyond psychiatry and mental health, beyond the Carl Jung, Eric Fromm, Eric Berne genre of people, right? Um, who I think are important, from Kafka to George Orwell to the Second World War. How can I forget his name? The guy who wrote Meaning of Man in Man, the
Viktor
Logos
Frankl.
Revolution.
Viktor Frankl.
Pardon
Man's
me?
Search for Meaning.
Viktor Frankl,
Viktor Frankl. Yeah.
right? So there is a whole lot of that. Far too much. But I do let this switch tracks again a little. I do believe, as again I've heard my friends now that you are in London and you're operating there, you might already be doing this, but everything to do with popular cinema or popular social culture, or where you are working as a psychiatrist, is important.
It is absolutely. Yeah.
You know, and I went through that in its own small way. Beside the Baltimore London experiences, briefly, within India, from Gujarat to Bangalore to Delhi, and Delhi from South Delhi to the Shadra thing. So like you and I are both saying, from micro to meso to macro level, the socio-cultural and the milieu, context and the milieu, are actually very important. And yet, if I might raise a question, reversing the roles, what would be a good answer to a question if we were to both try and attempt about, is a universal model of mind possible by now?
Hmm.
Uh, I would say yes. Is a universal model of mental health possible? I'd say yes, with some qualifications. Is a universal model of mental health care possible? Yes. Diagnosis, yes, but very guarded, because one will have to then really take care of, like we said earlier, not underdoing or overdoing it. To come back to that for a minute again, and you might want to weave this in, as you think best. To go back to that, the challenge for, I think, India, South Asia, and the largest part of Afro-Asian continents is this: treatment gap, as we'll both remember, is anywhere between 70 to 80%.
Hmm.
Okay. So on the one hand, there is definitely a need for increased mental health awareness, removing the stigma, getting people to come forth for treatment, and everybody, but everybody, if not everybody, at least majority of the people who can benefit from treatment must get treatment and mental health services. And yet at the same time, you don't want to overdo it.
Hmm.
You don't want to repeat the error, inverted commas, that the Western world and specifically the US, I think, with all respect to the American culture, has already made. I don't know whether we'll be able to succeed in doing that in next 25 or 30 years. I do believe we will. There's the other related idea, Manan, about this that we have not spoken about at all in our interactions too, but that is to do with the same idea in the context of socio-economic technological development. That is, uh, on the face of it, it would seem that across global history or even within India, which is a huge country with a lot of variation, the moment or the period when a society or a state or a small European nation moves from rural agrarian to technological mode to a well-developed, technically sound nation, and with all amenities provided, mental health and social indicators always go awry.
Hmm. Hmm.
Is there a model of social technological or economic development that's possible where mental health remains within control? Right? It's as a mental health professional, as a public health guy, it's always fascinated me, and I've tried raising this question in many places. Uh, there are possibly a few good examples. The Nordic countries, to a great extent, small countries like New Zealand, or totalitarian societies like Singapore or some countries in the Gulf. But if you have a largish country to manage, if you have a multi-ethnic, multiracial society, if you have a democratic model and freedom of choice, as the UNCRPD advocates, then is it possible to have a good development model with mental health being preserved to be good? I don't know. I really do believe, and like you were referring to earlier, not just the formal, ritualized part of spirituality, but the hidden, nebulous, non explored, unconscious part of spirituality in Jungian formulation that we in India and South Asia carry. Will that help? Will India by 2047 be able to demonstrate not just being in the top of the echelon of the developed nations, but also mental health indicators being well under control?
Do you think, like, one of the hypotheses I know is that a society, as a society, becomes richer, and the more people go on benefits, or the more the social security side of things becomes more and more, that in the US, that I know that there are loads of conversations, especially because the presidential elections are coming up, and
Yeah.
Vivek Ramasamy has made this thing that mental health issues are increasing because we are essentially, a lot of people aren't working now. If we factor in the whole AI side of things, what Elon Musk says is that there is going to be a future where all the menial jobs will be done for you, will be replaced, and hence you can choose to work if you want, but you will not need to work to live. And in that case, if you don't need to work to live, then what is rehabilitation, or what is vocational training, or is vocation actually?
Yes, and so also, as against the dilemma that I was posing, you pose an even more acute dilemma. How much of a welfare or an assistive state should any state be?
Yeah.
But again, see, if you switch gears from there to say individual family settings, think about it, man, and I think it's a valid point. I'm just supporting that idea at a micro level. In a family, a person with disability of whatever kind, including mental health illness and disability, uh, what the family can do is kind of protect, look after the person well. But as I often seen, can unknowingly, unintentionally get overprotective,
Hmm.
and so not enable, really, not empower,
Yeah.
right? To empower a person with disability, be it an individual or a group, or a large group in a nation, there will have to be some amount of push and motivation.
Hmm.
Now, what you are arguing is that if a welfare state or a very compassionate state looks after all its needs of persons with disability and their caretakers, is it possible that we lose? Something occurs to me. There are. I'm very fond of, like I said, George Orwell and what's called in literary circles a negative utopia.
Hmm.
Okay, Ram Rajya is a positive utopia.
Hmm.
Uh, Negative utopias essentially portray the worst that could happen to human race. And in the 1970s, you might not have heard, there was a very classic book for the English speaking world, especially women groups, called Thorn Birds.
Hmm.
Okay, there is an Australian lady now, so I think settled in US, called Colin McCullough.
Hmm.
She has written a book published in the 70s,
Hmm.
set in 2033, which now is just 10 years away, but that time it was long time away. And Colin McCullough described in this book called A Creed for the Third Millennium a situation where human race had lost all its motivation and drive to work.
Hmm.
In fact, she used the term, I think coined the term millennial neurosis. So do look up that book if you wish to. And to touch upon another recent experience of our human race, in during the epidemic,
Hmm.
I sometimes was wondering, while I was still in a job at IBAS, and we were working for a whole lot of programs, conceptually I was wondering if the epidemic might have uh, contributed to bringing forth the reality of what Colin McCullough had predicted, millennial neurosis. Is it possible that human race, I kept thinking in 2021, and so is it possible that human race is going to go towards millennial neurosis? But that's where comes my other conviction. I'm a huge meliorist. Um, and that is that human race, whatever errors it might make, it generally corrects itself.
Hmm.
And the epidemic, I really do believe, has proved that idea of human resilience as well as human race finding its the correct way out of a situation very well. So that idea of millennial neurosis, as Colin McCullough described, is out. In that context, I must mention that George Orwell, who also wrote The Animal Farm, wrote this famous book called 1984, again published in 1949. Okay, some 30 odd years before that. That's another negative utopia. So what you are posing is could be a serious concern. There's also, can we come back to India for a minute, and let me share my concern. As you are aware, and I'm sure a lot of our friends watching this are aware, for last 10 or 20 years, if not more, not only the World Bank and the IMF have been telling us, but we also realize that we have a population pyramid which is bulging at the lower end.
Hmm.
So we are, as some people like saying, we are the youngest nation right now. Our large group of population is between 15 to 35. Okay. While that is great, I think what needs to be realized is that the same bulge in the population pyramid at the bottom is moving up slowly.
Hmm.
And so by 2050 or 2060, that bulge is going to be the elderly population. So, like it's happening in Japan and a few countries right now, there'll be a whole lot of elderly population for the society to support with a smaller proportion of working people. Now, as you were referring to AI, will AI find solutions to this?
Hmm.
I think it will. It can. That, see, because the whole thing has changed from pre-industrial era to in the post-industrialization. It was the production that mattered. Now it's the knowledge that matters, data that matters. So hopefully there'll be some way out. But mental health future of human race is a serious concern. um, One, do we want to replicate the Western model for the rest of the world? Do we want to have disability rights or the human rights model exactly same applicable everywhere? Do we want to contextualize? Three, would we learn better to look after our mental health, like you said so poignantly, through spirituality, through right lobe than the left lobe? You see, would we use our right lobe more uh, than we have done? You know, those are good questions. You remember that book, Scott Peck,
I've
The
not read.
Road Less Traveled?
I've not read that one. What
Oh,
was that
well, you
about?
must. In the 90s, there is this American psychiatrist who has also written a few books after that, but he wrote this massive bestseller,
Hmm.
The Road Less Traveled.
Hmm.
And essentially, what he said was that human race is getting too oriented to left lobe,
Hmm.
and we don't use the right lobe too much. Again, in micro level social interactions or at the macro level, and so that's another good direction to
Like
see
one.
how we want to develop.
But one of the things that, like with right lobe or spirituality, we do live in a world which is massively obsessed with quantification or documentation. I feel we
Yeah.
want evidence based results, but how do
Yes.
you evidence art, or how do you quantify art? I suppose the there is a way to do that, and that's how AI is generated. Do you think that, before say 4 5 years, I used to constantly feel that we are blessed to be in a field which will not be replaced by AI, but I see there's a AI
You did not
therapist
right,
called
right?
Khair which will talk to you much better than any
Yeah.
proper legit qualified therapist would. And it's already there, the technology is already there, free at the point of access. Do you see us having jobs 20 years from now, is what I frankly want to
Oh
ask.
yes. Oh yes. If nothing else, to manage those AI generated and AI managed systems. You
Right.
see? So instead of doing direct service delivery, you might well be managing those. But allow me to say this there, and you might know this a lot better. Um, in last 1 or 2 years, also Indian psychiatric groups have been discussing this issue of AI and what it will do. It's not too much of a problem that AI generated algorithms and systems can work for diagnosis, perhaps for some treatment algorithms too. The If at all, the question would be for counseling and therapy. Would human clients accept AI generated therapies as the same? My sense, as it emerged in one of the discussions in Srinagar recently, is this. And tell me if you know this, or is already having happened, or as a possibility. The major difference between AI based therapies and human thing is the empathy,
Hmm.
the compassion. The time that AI can simulate empathy, there'll be a groundbreaking time, right? To my understanding, that's still a bit far out. Empathy and compassion, perceived by the provider, more importantly received and perceived by the client.
Yeah.
Okay, but it's not improbable at all that the AI will find ways of simulating empathy. Here I must say this, and again, if you have space, include this, or you can put this out. But even in actual therapy and counseling, and I do fair bit of individual and family and couples therapy, if we are honest to ourselves, we must admit that ever so often the empathy or the compassion in therapy sessions is simulated.
Hmm.
I'm not saying it's artificial,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But it's simulated. On a given afternoon, I may not be feeling at the top of the world. I might have troubles of my own and my issues, but to the client, I convey enough empathy, and so I simulate it, right? Because that's my job.
I,
So it just remains for AI to somehow pick up that trick
yeah. I
and
don't
say,
know if this is how you feel as well, but I have noticed that in my little career that I've had so far,
hmm,
that whenever I'm giving someone therapy, I end
hmm.
up usually saying something or the other that I need to tell myself.
Oh yeah, of course.
It is very
That's
therapeutic for me as well, as much as it
very
is
much,
for the other person.
very much, very much. Sure, that of course is true, and a whole lot of such things about how actually we all benefit from what we do. Bottom line. So our claim might be that we are helping others, but we might actually be helping ourselves. Simulated empathy and all the Rogerian factors, uh, Rogerian factors for, and if you remember what Jerome Frank identified as
Hmm.
non-specific factors in therapy. So, Jerome Frank's non-specific factors and Rogerian elements, the time that AI will develop the ability to do that, simulated. But no, I'm sure you won't be jobless. To repeat myself, like I believe. See, what will happen is not just you will have bright future, but many of you will possibly be developing those programs, monitoring those, and making sure things go in order.
Yes.
You
Uh,
know, um, that's interesting. Hmm.
Sir, finally, before we call it a day,
Hmm.
what are the top things that you would want someone who is, say, starting their career in mental health as a mental health nurse, psychiatrist, to keep in mind about, say, the future, the past, the current of mental health?
In a lighter vein, I again keep saying this too. Some decades ago, or certainly a century or a little over that ago, in different cultures it was slightly different. In the Catholic or Christian tradition, it was the clergyman, but at least in India and some parts of the world, who used to do the job that we do now, at
Hmm.
least some part, the hairdresser, the nai.
They
Okay.
used to be surgeons as well, no? They used to do surgery.
Yes, yes. And this part, I remember vaguely having seen it in my own childhood in that small little place in Gujarat, Patan. Um, there would be this small nice shop, and the client will come and sit down there. Hair cutting hoga, everything else, and the guy will keep chattering his own difficulties. The Nai will kind of say, I understand. Okay, so let's while we must take all health professionals and all helping profession. I have this broader conceptualization of all of us being in what I call as helping professions. No social workers, all of us. While we must retain the seriousness of it, simultaneously, it's also good to realize that we are a relatively new science or a field of work, and hopefully it will transform completely or disappear. Who knows? So let's not take ourselves too seriously, also. Our human race might possibly do better without psychiatry. Who knows? That's lighter ways. We are needed, and we will definitely be needed for the future, and especially for younger generation. What I really have a concern about is what's beginning to be realized: care for the carers. See, medical doctors, if not all health professionals, are not very good at self care and are extremely good at neglect and delay in seeking help and all of that. And that applies, unfortunately, to psychiatrists and mental health professionals much more.
Hmm.
So, the first thing we must realize and try and practice is mental health care for oneself. Again, without making much a hullabaloo about it, but in a normative, routine manner, let's make sure we can help ourselves and help each other. The at the root cause of this is the social belief that I think the society also tends to imbue in us, and that is that if you are a medical person, you cannot have physical illnesses. If you're a mental health professional, you cannot have mental health issues.
Yeah.
BS, whole lot of BS. A mental health professional, including psychiatrists, can have depression, can develop alcoholism, can have schizophrenia, can have transient issues. So do that. And most, perhaps the last that I've written someplace, to me it seems that destigmatization or acceptance of mental health has to begin with us. Now,
Yeah.
you have seen teams like you said, Bhavesh Lakrawala Sahib, your own dad, and many others. How many of us, especially senior people in a leadership position in a team, would have comfort to join the team one morning and say, you know what? I'm not at my best today. I have tension headache, or I'm having depression or sadness. I think we need to imbibe that. Neutral, non-stigmatized acceptance of mental health must begin with us. So, and take care of both. It will reduce stigma and help better acceptance. And also, we should look after our own mental health. So, that care for the carers is possibly one mantra, again at micro, meso, or macro level, that we really need to look after.
Absolutely. I think that's a beautifully poignant point, that mental health, especially, and we tend to analyze ourselves a lot of times, but we
Oh, yeah.
tend to stay away
Oh,
from.
I must share you this again. At least for our chat, this expectation that, like you're saying, we analyze ourselves, and do you or I or your dad or Bhavish, right? Do we play psychiatrist all 24/7? And I saw this wonderful Javed Akhtar, the noted celebrity lyricist, is extremely intelligent and much more. So I heard him say this very nicely on a television interview. Very briefly, somebody asked him a very similar question and say, Javed Saab, do you keep reciting romantic poetry to Shabana? And Javed Akhtar said, you know what, this logic is fundamentally flawed in as much as that if everybody were to be living in his or her personal life the profession that he is in, a trapeze artist of a circus at his home should never be sitting down on a sofa. He should be hanging upside down all the time. He doesn't, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%.
Love that simile and say, but society expects that we also tend to do that. So,
Yeah,
like you might have seen, and your dad is very good about this, and many people who I know, outside of where it is required, you or I don't have to be playing the shrink role all the time.
all the time. Yeah,
Just be a human being, just be a person.
yeah. It's
You
a
know?
part that I do most of the times when I'm meeting friends outside of our specialty. When someone tells me that, oh, you're a psychiatrist, you must be analyzing me. And I'm like,
Right.
I don't do that for free. I don't.
Tell them Javed Akhtar's example of trapeze
Yeah.
artist. That
Ab-
is so well put.
yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for your time today. Thank you for
Thank
being
you,
generous
man. It's been
with the
wonderful. We'll keep in
technical
touch.
issues as
Bye.
well.
God bless.
Thank you.